Hello, I'm Sterling Burnett, Senior Fellow and Managing Editor of Environment and Climate News with the Heartland Institute. I'm pleased to be here with you today for the 8th presentation in our 14th International Conference on Climate Change lecture series. I thank everyone out there who is joining us. The 14th International Conference on Climate Change is about a month and a half away at Caesars Palace in Las Vegas, Nevada, running from October 15th to 17th. Anyone who wants to attend the event needs to start making their arrangements now. I can't stress this enough. We've got a block of rooms. We'd love to have you there, but we got to know you're coming. So please go sign up now. The conference's theme, the Great Reset, Climate Realism versus Climate Socialism, really captures the tone of the policies and regulations and laws being drawn up and proposed in Washington, D.C. If the Greens on Capitol Hill and in the many state capitals have their way, the government will be in charge of people's transportation and energy use, which means it will essentially have control of one of the most critical levers of the economy. He who controls energy controls economic growth. The lecture series presents brief previews of coming events at the conference's top speakers. Now, one aspect of the economy that I rarely address is banking and investments, that is, stocks and bonds. Because in the normal course of events, banking and investment policies fall outside of energy and environment policy and climate policy. As our guest today is here to discuss, however, that's not so anymore. I'm pleased to have as today's speakers Justin Danhof, Executive Vice President of the National Center for Public Policy Research and the longtime director of the National Center's Free Enterprise Project. As part of that, he has been the conservative movement's foremost shareholder activist. He has long fought to ensure shareholders' interest in having profitable and secure investments should be foremost in management's minds, including fighting against environmentalist attempts to get climate change and sustainability resolutions adopted by corporations that would hurt profits and returns to investors in pursuit of the demands of a small rump group of investors' demands to put their vision of environment and social responsibility above profits. If anyone was surprised when Exxon shareholders voted to appoint 3 left-wing climate change activists to its board of directors last year, Danhof and his team weren't. He will unpack how activist investors have teamed up with woke capital on Wall Street to rig the corporate proxy ballot and what that means for the future of American energy production and your stock portfolio. Justin will also discuss how the Biden administration, the regulatory state, and some crony capitalists at left-wing investment houses are trying to throttle fossil fuel use and production and dictate every company's environment, social responsibility, and corporate governance agenda. That's called ESG for short. Woke capitalist activist investors and the Biden administration's regulatory general is basically a 3-headed hydra seeking to cancel traditional energy. Before Justin takes control of the mic, I want to remind our audience, as with past presentations, if anyone has questions, please send them via the comments function on the program. We will have 10 to 15 minutes to answer questions at the end of Justin's talk. Justin, thanks for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sterling. It's my honor to present to this august crowd today on this really important topic. And I want to start with 3 dates: January 20th, April 14th, and May 26th. Keep all those dates in mind. I'm going to suggest to you that these are 3 of the most significant days so far in 2021 that may alter the future of oil and natural gas exploration and production here in the United States. The first date's rather obvious, right? President Biden's first day in office. What did he do? With the stroke of a pen, he issued an executive order canceling the Keystone XL pipeline. That pen stroke destroyed at least 1,000 jobs. It also decidedly set the trajectory for the Biden administration. The second date may be less obvious, April 14th. On that day, by a vote of 53 to 45 in the U.S. Senate, Gary Gensler was confirmed to the top spot at the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. He's part of an ever-revolving door between Wall Street and D.C., and he has given every indication that under his direction, the SEC is going to set up an ESG, that's environment, social, and corporate governance regulatory regime that would dramatically increase the cost of doing business here in the United States. The third date, May 26th, Sterling, you hinted on it. On that day, ExxonMobil held its annual shareholder meeting. Normally, this doesn't grab headlines, but this year it did, because engine number one, a tiny left-wing hedge fund, managed to place 3 dissident climate change activists on Exxon's board of directors. How many jobs will that destroy, and for what? It's tough to say. This leads me to my question for the audience. Are you all finally awake to the woke? You better be. Right now, we're facing a combination of the most woke presidential administration in American history, emboldened and organized investor advocates, and woke capital on Wall Street that seeks to dictate who can and can't receive funding. As Sterling said, this is a 3-headed hydra that won't be easy to slay, but we all better try. As Sterling said, my name is Justin Danhof, and I'm the Executive Vice President of the National Center for Public Policy Research, where I long oversaw our Free Enterprise Project. The Free Enterprise Project is the nation's only right-of-center dedicated shareholder activist organization. In the past 5 years, I've attended more than 150 shareholder meetings, filed over 130 shareholder resolutions, and had more than 200 meetings with C-suite executives. But this isn't about me. It's about the fact that I've lived so long in the belly of the beast that I've gained a tremendous insight into the activist left and how they operate to effectuate change in the corporate cultural lane. Again, none of us at the Free Enterprise Project were surprised when Exxon shareholders voted to appoint dissident climate change activists to their board. This is because the left has been so vocal and strategic at engaging businesses that many leading companies now march in lockstep with the political left. Some call this phenomenon woke capitalism. Some refer to these positions as corporate social responsibility. But again, more commonly, it falls under the ESG banner these days. But no matter what you call it, know that this is a paradigm shift where corporations are now no longer beholden to shareholders, but rather an amorphous set of, quote, stakeholders. In fact, in 2019, the Business Roundtable formally repudiated its shareholder model of capitalism in deference to this amorphous stakeholder model. It then actually comically proceeded to list all of the stakeholders it cared about, these businesses were going to be beholden to. Shareholders were at the end of the line. So we need to talk about how the business community, along with the Biden administration, got so woke and what we can do to combat it. One of the tools that the left has used in their corporate activism is shareholder activism. Over the last 15 years or so, a vast network of liberal organizations has used shareholder activism to bully, co-opt, and influence corporate America. And guess what, folks? This isn't some fringe groups. They represent trillions with a T, of dollars and assets. And they dedicate significant resources every single year to influence corporate behavior on issues such as the environment, healthcare, social and religious issues, life and the abortion debate, free speech, freedom of association, racial justice, political giving, philanthropic giving, and of course, they target companies that give to what they perceive as right-of-center groups or causes. Now, I'm not here to rail against business. American free market capitalism is the greatest system that mankind ever created to lift people out of poverty. But wokeness within inside of it, folks, it's a cancer. So we ought to try and kill the cancer while we save the host. But to set the stage, we ought to understand where American businesses stand right now. Let's briefly touch on two issues that aren't paramount to the energy industry per se, but they are to the fabric of American culture. The first is voter integrity, and the second is the Equality Act. This spring, after Georgia passed constitutional and common sense voter integrity reforms, Major League Baseball pulled its All-Star game out of Atlanta. Hundreds of leading companies came out against Georgia's legislation, calling it racist. This was, of course, false and wildly inoffensive. When it comes to the Equality Act, the legislation passed by the House and currently sitting in the Senate, this act would crush women's sports. It would harm women in multiple settings, including in shelters. And it literally excises the Religious Freedom Restoration Act out of federal law. This would put millions of faithful Americans in harm of persecution. But guess what? The Chamber of Commerce supports the Equality Act. The Business Roundtable supports the Equality Act. the National Association of Manufacturers, and more than 400 companies have teamed up with the Human Rights Campaign to back it and are trying to get it over the hill in the US Senate. Think about that. Again, these may not be issues that you care a lot about, but you need to step back and ask, how did the business community in America get to the political left of Barack Obama? It's shocking, but it's true. On basically every affinity issue you can think of, there are coordinated efforts to dictate corporate capital and action. So let's step back. We have to figure out how to combat ESG, stakeholder capitalism, wokeness, whatever you want to call it. To do so, we have to ask some basic questions. How does the left influence corporate action, and why? I'm going to start with the why. The left uses corporate activism so well because, in my estimation, they've understood three key aspects. First, corporations are more amenable to pressure than most politicians in Washington, right? Most of our House members live in gerrymandered districts. It's very hard to get them to move on issues. Second, corporations can move much more quickly than the political, legislative, or legal process to effect change. And third, corporations can have an immediate economic or jobs impact on a targeted region. Remember, Atlanta businesses lost $100 million just because Major League Baseball pulled their All-Star game. That's an immediate economic impact. Put it another way, as Andrew Breitbart was fond to say, politics is downstream from culture. And I'm going to add to that it's upstream from business. So the other question, how? How does the left do it? In a word, engagement. One way the left engages is through voting. I'm not talking about the political ballot box. I'm talking about the shareholder vote. Thousands of votes are cast each year that you may not be aware of, but you should be, because they have a dramatic effect on our collective culture. They take place at annual corporate shareholder meetings. There's votes for board members, management proposals, and shareholder proposals. And I'm here to tell you folks, what happens at annual meetings it's frankly shameful. It's the equivalent of an annual red or purple state election that is increasingly going blue because the left rigged the vote and the right didn't show up. What does the big picture landscape look like for proposals? Well, at the Free Enterprise Project, we file about 25 liberty-based proposals per year. Left-leaning groups file 400 to 500 annually. And again, these aren't fringe left-wing investors. It includes some of the nation's largest pension funds, asset managers, environmental groups, trade unions, government officials, liberal religious orders, progressive foundations, and wealthy individual liberal investors. If I put up a pie chart of all the groups on the left that engage in this activism compared to those on the right, you wouldn't even see the Free Enterprise Project sliver. You know, CalPERS, CalSTRS, Boston Common Asset Management, the Ceres Coalition, they all work under this umbrella group called As You Sow, SOW. Of course, the left is always good at commandeering biblical languages and perverting it for their purposes. But while these guys aren't necessarily fringe groups, let me tell you, they have fringe ideas. Many of them believe in socialist and even Marxist causes. And here's the point, the financial point of all of this. They have zero interest in the financial performances of the companies with which they engage. Pardon the pun, but they use the corporate proxy ballot as a proxy for the culture wars. The left knows that they don't always need to win a legal or legislative battle to change the culture. If they can change business behavior, attitudes, and actions, sometimes that's enough. Here are just some examples. So President Trump pulled us out of the disastrous Paris Climate Accord when he was in office, right? That's okay. We'll just file resolutions forcing companies to join it, which is what the left did. Liberals in Congress can't pass a law mandating race and gender quotas for corporate boards because that's wildly unconstitutional, of course. That's okay. The left files resolutions demanding that companies do it on their own. The political left gets mad at states that pass pro-life legislation or, crazy laws in their eyes that dictate that boys play boy sports and girls play girl sports. It's not a problem. The activists are just demanding that businesses in those states relocate. I think you get the point. But I still get pushback sometimes. Folks will say to me, Justin, shareholder proposals aren't legally fully binding on companies, so why should we care? It's simple, because they move the needle. Let me give you one concrete example. 3 to 4 years ago, As You Sow affiliated organizations with the backing of Jesse Jackson started filing shareholder resolutions demanding affirmative action for corporate boards. That is, you must have a woman and an underrepresented minority on your board. Well, fast forward to 2020, what happened then? Goldman Sachs came out and said they would not finance your IPO unless your board was sufficiently diverse in its eyes. And the NASDAQ put through a request that the Securities and Exchange Commission has approved that they are now going to delist any company from their public exchange. That is, they're going to kick them off unless they have 2 diverse board seats. Now, you may not care about board diversity, but the fact that they were allowed to ask for that, what's to say next year they won't come back and say, if you're not carbon neutral by 2040, they're going to delist you from their exchange? We need to pay attention, folks. And that's the point, is in 3 to 4 years, the agent of change went from shareholder proposals from Jesse Jackson and As You Sow to Goldman Sachs and the NASDAQ. It goes from activism to mainstream in that shorter period of time. And I could give you more examples of how that's happened. So what happened this year, the 2021 shareholder season? Well, we filed 24 liberty-oriented proposals. Meanwhile, liberal interest groups filed more than 400. And to put this in financial terms, just one organization in this network, just one, CalPERS, manages $400 billion in assets. By comparison, the entire conservative shareholder activist push, largely us at the Free Enterprise Project, we have less than $1 million in dedicated assets and have an annual budget even less than that. And what was the number one topic that the left went after this year? Well, of course, the environment. They focused on carbon asset risk, GHG emission reduction targets. They focused on climate change lobbying, net zero targets, natural gas development, high carbon financing, and much more. And these proposals are experiencing record levels of success. Let's just ask the folks at Chevron. Last year, over the objection of the company's board, 53%, and I'm using air quotes for a reason, of Chevron shareholders approved a resolution calling on the company to align its lobbying with the Paris Climate Accords. Think about that. That would mothball Chevron, right? Politico dubbed this a watershed moment. I call it a disaster. And if you think about the depth of the proposal, it really has nothing to do with climate at all. By going after the, quote, climate-related lobbying, what are they actually trying to do? They're trying to defund any trade association or organization that Chevron gives money to, right? The proposal really should have been titled, Name Names and then we'll sully your company and everyone you donate to until you stop donating to those, quote, climate skeptics. That would have been a more accurate title. And if you don't believe me that this bullying technique works, just ask the fine folks at the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC. Using lies about ALEC's voter integrity work, and work they don't even do in the climate arena, they just made that part up, the shareholder activists on the left have managed to bully more than 100 companies over the last few years into dropping their membership in ALEC. It's a wildly successful tactic that the left employs. But you should keep something in mind. These companies that caved, they didn't appease the left because you can't appease a mob. So now they file resolutions demanding that companies cut ties with the Chamber of Commerce, the Business Roundtable, NAM, the National Restaurant Association, and many others. Some of these organizations are hardly right of center. Some have even turned downright hard left. But it doesn't matter. Once the activists label you an enemy, you're stuck with that label for life. So now let's turn back to the activist Chevron investors. Were they satisfied with their shareholder proposal win in 2020? Nope. This year, they filed a resolution calling on Chevron to cut its Scope 3 emissions. How did that one fare? Well, 61% of shareholders voted in favor of that restrictive resolution. I guarantee you next year they'll be back for another pound of flesh. Does anyone think that climate activists are better suited to make decisions about Chevron's lobbying priorities and emission goals than the company's management? More importantly, do most shareholders that invest their money with Chevron, presumably with the hopes of making a return on that investment, actually want the company to put itself out of business? Of course not. But that's not what's being reflected in the corporate proxy vote. So we need to examine just how the vote got so disassociated from the financial goals of actual investors. Well, part of the reason is that most of stock in America is held institutionally. So if you own a mutual fund, for example, you almost certainly have given up your rights to vote on your corporate proxy ballots. And when it comes to advising those fund managers how to vote, two firms control more than 97% of the market: Institutional Shareholder Services, or ISS, and Glass Lewis. And they are extremely woke. They regularly support liberal ESG resolutions. And in 12 years of filing shareholder resolutions, they have never once supported my right of center work. They're supposed to be neutral arbiters, but they're not. Think about it. They endorsed both of those Chevron shareholder proposals. How would aligning the policies of the Paris Climate Accord increase Chevron's shareholder value? Of course it wouldn't. For decades, ESG shareholder proposals universally received only single-digit support, and then ISS and Glass Lewis shifted. So in 2018, liberal ESG resolutions received record support with an average vote of 24.8%. In 2019, they broke that record again. In 2020, they broke it. And this year, we've seen a record number of liberal climate proposals break the 50% barrier. And what's causing more liberal ESG resolutions to break that 50% mark, in addition to ISS and Glass Lewis? In a word, BlackRock. In two words, Larry Fink. BlackRock is the largest asset manager in the world. Its CEO is Larry Fink. The company has $9 trillion with a T in assets under management. And since Wall Street is such a follow the leader industry, other large asset managers such as State Street and Vanguard generally take direction from BlackRock. Now, the key thing to note about these firms is that they are asset managers, meaning the $9 trillion that BlackRock has, that's other people's money. So for the longest time, it was industry standards that these companies would not vote on their corporate proxy ballots. This makes quite a bit of sense, right? Think about it. Since it's other people's money, i.e. investors that presumably have a wide range of views on certain board members and certain policy positions and shareholder proposals, how could BlackRock possibly vote for all of that? They couldn't. It would be inappropriate and presumptuous. Inappropriate and presumptuous are frankly generous terms to describe BlackRock CEO Larry Fink. In 2018, he changed the entire model for passive money managers. That year, Fink explained that the company was going to get much more aggressive in voting its proxy ballots. He wrote at length about the need for action on climate change and the business community's role in fixing a whole myriad of social issues. Liberal activists at the time cheered the move. Yet, were they satisfied? Nope. Year after year, they continued to complain that BlackRock still isn't doing enough to press businesses on ESG measures. Remember what I said earlier. You can't appease the liberal mob. So in 2020, BlackRock upped the ante and voted against more than 5,400 board members because in Larry Fink's view, these companies weren't doing enough to combat climate change. But that wasn't enough. So late last year, a group of Democrat senators sent a letter to Fink demanding that BlackRock, quote, live up to its public commitment to climate action. And I have no idea what they're going to crow about this year, but I'm sure they will, because BlackRock really upped the ante. According to the Wall Street Journal, Fink means business on climate resolutions. The journal notes that for the roughly 170 ESG shareholder proposals it voted on during the first half of the proxy year, BlackRock backed 91%. 91% of liberal environmental resolutions. And these votes matter. BlackRock is one of the top 3 shareholders in more than 80% of the companies in the S&P 500. One of the top 3 in 80%. That's an enormous amount of pressure. There was one shareholder meeting that stuck out to me this year because a CEO finally grew a spine and pushed back against Fink. That was at Berkshire Hathaway. There was 2 shareholder proposals that were up for a vote at Berkshire Hathaway's meeting. One was requiring the company to run a racial audit through all of their businesses, and the other was a climate risk across all of your portfolio type audits. Well, Buffett called out BlackRock specifically, and he noted that, quote, overwhelmingly, the people that brought Berkshire with their own money voted against these propositions. most of the votes for them came from people who never put a dime of their own money into Berkshire. He called the two resolutions, quote, asinine. But think about it. You have two proxy advisory firms, ISS and Glass Lewis, that have zero combined dollars invested in Berkshire Hathaway, that think they know better how to run the company than the company's board. And BlackRock's CEO Fink, who, again, votes with other people's money, thought he knew better than the Oracle of Omaha how to run Berkshire's business. But the Wall Street Journal warned that once Buffett's gone, the dike is probably going to break, because the only reason that they were able to hold off the votes this year is because so many investors have great fidelity to Warren Buffett. So back to that date of May 26, just how did engine number one, a tiny little hedge fund, manage to place 3 dissident climate change activists on ExxonMobil's board? Frankly, it was easy. ISS and Glass Lewis rigged the vote, and then Larry Fink used other people's money to get them over the hurdle. So with all the success that liberal climate activists and these despotic leaders in Wall Street are having in influencing corporate behavior and corporate dollars, it would almost seem like they don't need help from the Biden administration, right? But boy, are they about to get some. That brings me to the date of April 14th, when Gary Gensler was confirmed to lead the SEC. While the Keystone decision was wrong-headed and had a negative jobs impact, and the climate change activists are going to harm Exxon, I'm going to suggest that Gensler is going to do more damage in the long run. That's because he and the 2 other liberal SEC commissioners are planning to change the definition of a single word. That word is materiality. For nearly 75 years, the SEC's materiality standards has required corporations to publicly disclose to potential investors and shareholders information that is significant, i.e. material, to making informed investment and proxy ballot voting decisions. Importantly, when companies identify and disclose what information is deemed significant, they filter out information that is not relevant to investors. Gensler is going to change all of that. On March 15th, prior to Gensler's confirmation, far-left SEC Commissioner Allison Herron-Lee put out a request for comment on new ESG disclosures, specifically focused on climate change. She wrote that since 2010, investor demand for and company disclosure information about climate change risks, impacts, and opportunities have grown dramatically. There are so many dangers in letting the federal government set ESG reporting standards, it's hard to pinpoint which ones would do the most damage. Immediately, of course, the compliance costs are going to go through the roof. And really, the unstated goal of Gensler and the other liberal leaders at the SEC is the same as liberal shareholder proponents. It's to name and shame. Just think about it, what Lee asked for. And until now, who have been the ones clamoring for greater ESG reporting from individual companies? It's been liberal shareholder activists whose real goal is to shame companies that aren't meeting their arbitrary benchmarks for CO2 emissions or gender diversity in the C-suite or enough donations to Black Lives Matter, etc. The SEC is just taking up the mantle of the shareholder activists, and they're painting with a broad brush. Another obvious problem, how are they going to set across-the-board standards when we have a myriad of different industries in this country? Some industries obviously use more carbon. Others lend themselves to more gender and ethnic diverse talents. Others finance different industries. How can Chevron, Facebook, Boeing, and Bank of America possibly be level set on an ESG score? It doesn't make any sense. But what I see as the most concerning is potential future iterations of any ESG regulatory scheme. In her request for comments, Commissioner Lee staked out a set of questions. And one of them she asked, quote, how should any disclosure requirements be updated, improved, augmented, or otherwise changed over time? Just like shareholder activists, bureaucrat activists are never satisfied. In fact, the shareholder activists laid out the model for the SEC in terms of setting marks and then moving the goalposts over time. In the environmental realm, shareholder activists have a pattern of ratcheting up their requests every year. It goes something like this. Year 1, file a resolution demanding a company make a statement about their environmental commitments. Year 2, based off that statement they got the company to make in year 1, file a proposal calling on them to stop funding all Republican politicians and trade associations that aren't on board with the current climate hysteria crowd. Year 3, file a proposal seeking GHG reductions. Year 4, file a proposal demanding net zero by an arbitrary date, say 2050. And once they get that, they then subsequently file and say, well, now we need 2045, 2040, 2035, et cetera, et cetera. You get it. Now imagine the SEC having the power to set arbitrary ESG requirements and then shifting them similarly over time. And again, the goal here is to name and shame companies in an effort to defund any organization that doesn't go along with the left. And companies that have made commitments to these climate activists over the year, even vague ones, you better pay attention. Since taking the helm, Gensler has made it clear that he intends to hold the companies to those commitments. In a speech last month, he said, I've asked the staff to consider potential requirements for companies that have made forward-looking climate commitments or that have significant operations in jurisdictions with national requirements to achieve specific climate-related goals. Think about that. You better not think that you're, appeasing the liberal mob by saying, yes, we'll be carbon neutral by 2050 and not planning to live up to it. Gensler's going to hold you to it. And he's not going to stop at the E of ESG. Oh, no. He went on to note that investors have said they want to better understand one of the most critical assets of a company, its people. To that end, I've asked my staff to propose recommendations for the Commission's consideration on human capital disclosure. I don't know about you, but the first thing I want to know before I invest in a company is if their C-suite makes hire decisions based on affirmative action and sexual orientation of the candidates. Believe me, when the SEC also wants to know what kind of trainings your companies are running, you better have mandatory critical race theory trainings, or Black Lives Matter is going to protest your company and picket outside of the houses of the board members. Bet on that. This is all, of course, insane, but it's happening in real time. So I encourage all of you, you must do everything you can within your power to push back on the SEC standard to change the materiality standard. It's not hyperbole to say that the materiality standard, the type which is being proposed by Gensler and Lee, is the most existential threat facing the oil and natural gas industry today. Liberals, independents, and conservatives are all invested in the capital markets. The goal of most of those investors is to get a return on their capital. Most investors aren't trying to social engineer or act as a puppet master for the Davos crowd like Mr. Fink. The materiality standard may seem like a wonkish topic, but it directly impacts every American with money in the capital markets, as well as every American consumer. It is vital that the SEC continue its long-standing practice of only requiring companies to disclose that information that is relevant, not the whims of the ESG crowd. I hope I haven't scared anybody, but I hope I've made it clear to you that woke capital, activist investors, and the Biden administration are out to cancel the oil and natural gas industry. It'll take bold action to slay this three-headed hydra. Let's hope we all have the courage to do so. Thanks so much.
Well, Justin, I got to tell you, I don't come away from your discussion very encouraged. It's a little depressing. I'm going to take it on myself, the moderator's prerogative, so to speak, to ask the first question. And my question is this. So by law, many retirement funds are obligated by law to have a fiduciary duty to not take actions that they can reasonably expect will cause a loss of their fund. That they're supposed to be there, as you say, protecting retirees, protecting investors who invest not. There are people that invest to make social statements, but most people and most corporations, I can't think of a single corporation that wasn't founded to make a profit. So my question is this: the government is in the position now of considering mandating ESG standards. Why should anyone, I think that should be, I guess, beyond the government's power. It's corporations are founded to make a profit, and they should have to disclose, and they do, as you say, material things that might affect their profit, because they're not supposed to be defrauding investors or potential investors. But you've got ways of if you don't like how a corporation's operating, you can try it through shareholder resolution, or you can found your own corporation that's intended just to do ESG goals, or you can found a green corporation. There are lots of them out there. There are green funds out there. If that's what an investor's most important concern is making sure his money is made on green or woke goals. There are funds that do that. Why should everybody be forced into the same standard when not everybody shares those goals? And how did a very small rump group of actual investors gain so much influence?
Yeah, so to your point, the Trump administration did really good work on fund managers and holding them accountable. Under the Department of Labor, Secretary Eugene Scalia put forth some great rulemakings doing just exactly what you said, reminding fund managers that their sole purpose with an eagle eye is return on investment. That they held ERISA-backed funds. They put out a rulemaking saying that you have a singular goal, and that is the pecuniary interest of your investors. So guess what happened after the Trump administration left town? The Biden administration immediately announced they weren't going to enforce that. And so that is, and again, this is a little bit, bureaucratic, a little bit wonkish, but undoing that is what laid the pathwork for what the SEC is now trying to do, and that is make ESG reporting standard across the board. And that will give the new Department of Labor under President Biden the ability to wiggle out of the great rulemakings that came from the Trump administration. So that's exactly the path that they're taking. And again, I can't overstate the importance of maintaining the current materiality standard. And I like to give folks, what can we do about it? Well, it will go to a formal rulemaking process at the SEC. The SEC, first of all, has dubious legal authority to do this. The SEC was founded to protect investors, and by requiring information out of companies that has nothing to do with investment decisions, they're outside of the purview of their legal authority, in my view, to start with. But if we don't file comments, we're gonna lose. So, Heartland should file comments, individual investors should file comments. We're going to file comments because the notice and comment period of a rulemaking like this, and again, this is one of the most important rulemakings in probably a decade, that is the start of the legal suit. So lawsuits will need to abound if they go forward with it. And if it's shown that the SEC ignored comments that are substantive, that bring up real regulatory and legal issues, that can be basis for a court to throw the rulemaking out.
On an earlier proposal, and we signed on to other people's comments. I guess I'll go to the second question. I may have a question for closing. Mark Davis asks, when you say shareholders versus stakeholders, who are the stakeholders? I understand who shareholders are, and you're supposed to be beholden to your investors after all, they're the owners of the company, but he's not sure what stakeholders are. I think that's a pretty good question.
It's a great question. So a stakeholder is everything and everybody all the time, right? It used to be the definition of stakeholder was, your customers, your employees, your neighborhood, right? Your community. That used to be the definition, but now it's, of course, Mother Earth. It's whatever PETA is demanding that day. And what is responsibility to everybody? Well, it's responsibility to nobody, right? So that's exactly what the Business Roundtable, when they redefine their statement of purpose to say we no longer care about shareholders, we care about stakeholders. It was so that left-wing CEOs like Brian Moynihan at Bank of America, Tim Cook at Apple, Mark Benioff at Salesforce, and Larry Fink, they can pick out which constituency they're responsible to that day and promote the causes that they want because they're responsible to everybody, which means they're responsible to nobody, so that they can continue to run the political games that they want with their corporate dollars.
I'm sorry, I'm going to do a follow-up, but how does running corporations out of business, making them less profitable, making the economy grow slower, help anyone? Banks, investment banks, large institutional investors. CalPERS basically refused a few years ago to adopt a resolution saying we got to get rid of fossil fuels, because they said our retirees won't be very happy about this when their portfolio goes down, which is what every study said it would do. So I'm really puzzled by the motive of this by not the rump small group of environmentalists or woke folks, because they still make up a very small percentage of the population, but the general public, more importantly, those who want to make a profit. Larry Fink, I don't believe, wants to have zero income next year. I could be wrong. Maybe he does. But I just don't believe it. I don't believe these guys are out there not to make a profit. So how can hurting the companies they invest in help their bottom line?
So there's a couple parts to the answer. There's not one blanket answer to that question. So let me take the Fink example first. Fink is a capitalist in a sense, because what he does is he bilks gullible liberals into paying him more so that he can tell them he's saving the world, right? So Fink makes money off of charging more for ESG funds and makes a lot of money off gullible liberals who invest in Fink to try and save the world. So there's capitalism in that, but where the harm is downstream, right? So how does voting for a liberal environmental resolution at like John Deere and Chevron and Exxon help them? It doesn't. So he's harming the bottom line of other companies on purpose to achieve his political agendas. So that's where Fink is both a capitalist and an anti-capitalist, right? Because he's harming other companies with, again, and they are one of the top 3 investors in 80% of the S&P 500. But then there's the other short-term, long-term problem we have. And I'll point to an example outside of the energy industry, and that's healthcare. If you looked at how Obamacare became law, well, it was backed by all the big insurance companies and all the big pharmaceutical companies, right? Pharma was all in on Obamacare, partly because they wrote themselves some bailouts within there, right? They got bailouts, the American people didn't. But the CEOs of all the large pharmaceutical companies were all gone within 4 years of Obamacare becoming law. And why is that? Because they know that they just notched a step in the direction to single payer healthcare, which will eventually mothball their companies when the government takes over the pharmaceutical industry, right? But they didn't care because they all got golden parachutes on the way out the door. So the short-term, long-term problem that we have where CEOs can make these reckless decisions that set their company up on the path to future failure, they're not held accountable for it. So that's a short-term, long-term problem. And again, it's a downstream problem when we talk about capital, and that's Wall Street capital dictating how other businesses operate without a concern for those businesses because they're trying to achieve social change. Fink isn't the only one. There's a lot of Wall Street actors that are just as mendacious as he is. He just happens to be the one with the most money.
An audience member named that calls themselves Hammer Time asks, and I think this is a really good question. He or she asks, should we still steal the tactics of the left? My suspicion is what they're really asking is how can we adopt their tactics and be successful? I think to promote liberty and profit. Look, I invest so that when I retire sooner than I'd like to admit, because I'm older than I like to admit, I retire, I want as much banked as possible in my fund because I want to live a pretty good life. I don't want to live poorer than I am now. So I want profit, but I also want freedom. I want to make decisions on my own. And so how can we adopt their tactics for success, for freedom and profit?
Well, like I said, multiple times I mentioned potential pie charts that I could put up, but you wouldn't even see the sliver on the right when it comes to engagement. And again, engagement is the key word here, right? The left shows up to shareholder meetings. They file 400 and 500 shareholder resolutions a year. Take it out of the environmental arena. The gun industry is just getting, hammered out there when it comes to capital. The NRA should start filing shareholder resolutions when it comes to social issues. Life. There are so many, affinity groups on the right that care about the right to life. Well, the left is hammering corporate America, making sure they donate to Planned Parenthood. Where are our conservative groups right of center engaging businesses in the same way the left engages businesses. So the single word is engagement. Vote your proxies. The evidence shows that the left votes at a lot higher rate than the right. So that's a problem. We're not voting. Like I said, an annual meeting is the equivalent of a red or purple state election that goes blue, because the blue, A, they rigged the vote, and B, we didn't even show up to start with. So they didn't really have to rig it that much, because the evidence bears out. When Al Gore gets 99% of the vote to stay on Apple's board, conservatives voting? I don't think so.
There you go. By the way, I appreciate the fact that your dog chimed in and said he's really, really opposed to these shareholder resolutions and woke capitalism. Your dog's heart is in the right place. I wish my dog were as vocal. So this is going to be the final question. Is there somewhere where our audience, and that doesn't just include those watching today, this will remain on YouTube and Heartland's channel, until we are canceled, which, may happen. But is there somewhere information about which companies are following left-wing values instead of solid business decisions? This comes from someone who identifies themselves as climate change scam.
Yeah, there's a couple different places that you can go. First of all, at nationalcenter.org, which is our website, we have 2 voter guides that really detail, first of all, shareholder resolutions at companies, and then company boards that are really, really bad, and individual board members that need to be highlighted. So that's a really good, valuable resource for folks that care about the topic that we've talked about today and going forward. And we publish those annually. And the second one I'll mention is Second Vote. They score companies on a set of conservative values and where they fall. So that's a helpful resource as well. And they also have launched a few ETFs that are counter to the ESG ETFs. So I encourage folks to look those up too.
Well, Justin, you've been a fount of information. You haven't made me happy, but you've made me better informed. I hope you've also done the same for our audience. I want to thank you for being on today, and for everyone in the audience for joining us.
Well, thank you, Sterling, and thank you to the Heartland Institute for hosting this important talk.
Now, before we sign off, I want to remind everyone that the event and every presentation we do in this series will remain available on Heartland's website and YouTube for anyone who wants to review and share them with friends who are unable to attend. In addition, please be on the lookout for notice of the next presentation in our climate change series. And I can't stress this enough before signing off. I want you to take the opportunity to encourage you once again to attend the 14th International Conference on Climate Change in person in Las Vegas this October. That's the reason for all these presentations. Now, this means signing up and making arrangements now, or at the very, very least, very soon. Please go to Heartland's website as in Heartland Daily News for the latest environment, energy, and climate news. Finally, I'd like to encourage you to support the Heartland Institute year-round. You can contact anyone, and they'll put you in contact with David Hoyt, Heartland's Executive Director of Development. He can tell you how you can help us be more successful in our mission. Thanks. Take care. Bye.